Okay, let's turn to 2 Samuel chapter 8. Second Samuel chapter 8, we've seen the promises that God has made to David in chapter 7, the covenant he made with him to bring about a time of prosperity during his time, and then also to extend his kingdom into the life of his son, his grandson, future descendants, and ultimately we see in the scripture all the way till the time of Messiah, who will reign forever. He will be an unending king on the throne. And yet these promises were truly immense, right? This is just not something that was imagined in that day and age, of course. The idea that one dynasty could sit on a throne forever, that one dynasty, that one family could sit on a throne for that long. And David, in his acceptance, in his prayer of thanksgiving and worship last week, you can see that he counts himself unworthy to receive such promises and such blessings. That doesn't mean he's going to say no. He, of course, like, Lord, yes, that which you've promised, do it. Perform those things. David's excited to receive these promises. In the coming weeks here, as you get into these next handful of chapters, we're going to start to see a lot of famous stories, a lot of famous names. We're going to see names like Mephibosheth and Bathsheba, more stuff with Nathan the prophet, some famous events, things with David's sons kind of start to take a turn. But chapter 8 is kind of sandwiched in there between that. And chapter 8 really deals with the full establishment and expansion of David's kingdom. So that's kind of what we want to cover tonight. There's 18 verses here in chapter 8, so it's a little much to try to combine with anything else. So we'll just try to cover chapter 8 tonight. And we're going to divide this up two ways. We'll talk about the wars of King David, and then we'll finish up with the administration of King David. But chapter 8 deals with how David's kingdom ultimately expanded. It expanded to great lengths, greater than Israel had seen to that point, and that future kings, aside from Solomon, weren't really going to see the largeness or the vastness of the kingdom that David ultimately ruled over. Number one, the wars of King David. It says in verse 1, and after this. So what does that mean? Well, chapter 7, right? That time of initial peace that David had secured, that time of blessing that had been granted by the Lord, the promises that David had been given. After this, it says that David smote the Philistines and subdued them. And David took Methegama out of the hand of the Philistines. God had blessed. They had had a time of peace and prosperity and even a time of rest. But now David is ready again. David is ready to pursue against the enemies of Israel, against the enemies of the Lord. The Philistines, and we don't have to go back to too many passages. That's a name you've heard before. That's a name you're familiar with. These are the old families, the old peoples that were just such a stubborn thorn in the side of the nation of Israel. They had troubled Israel for years, actually for generations. There was a time around the time of the judges, and even at times during the reign of King Saul, where the Philistines just dominated regions that really should have belonged to Israel, lands that they should have occupied. The Philistines kept their strongholds for generations. They were often victorious, and they would lose at times. Israel would win some battles, the Philistine would win some battles, but Israel constantly had them as a troublesome neighbor. Well, David attacks, and the Bible says there that he subdues them. And so we're talking there about not necessarily a back and forth, but you're talking about David on a grand scale, a large scale, getting victory. In 1 Chronicles chapter 18, you have the parallel telling of these events. First Chronicles chapter 18 and verse 1, it says, "Now after this it came to pass that David smote the Philistines and subdued them, and took Gath and her towns out of the hand of the Philistines." So we're past the days now. Under King David, we're not seeing the Philistines attack and occupy and take land away from Israel. In fact, you're seeing the opposite of that now. Under King David, Israel is taking the fight to them. Israel is taking cities and taking land away from them. David is a great king. David is not afraid or fearful. David does not allow past defeats to cripple Israel with fear. He is willing to attack. He is willing to go on the offensive, to fight against them, to claim an expansion for Israel among their lands. It's easy to see how at times, maybe King Saul or others during the time period of the judges were kind of happy with the status quo at times, just enough to reclaim maybe what they had lost. But David is willing to go against them. We're talking about Gath here, right? That's what 1 Chronicles 18 mentions. Does that name Gath sound familiar? You guys remember who was from Gath? I'll give you a hint. He was really tall. He was a giant. David is now willing to go and to pursue them, take the fight to them. And they win a great victory there, it says in our text. Now 2 Samuel 8 verse 2 says also that he smote Moab and measured them with a line. He's going to take their land. He's going to take and measure out their possessions. He's also casting them down, verse number 2, to the ground. Even with 2 lines measured he to put to death, and with 1 full line to keep alive. And so the Moabites became David's servants and brought gifts. Against the Moabites he found an utter victory, and they were brought under tribute. Now some see in that kind of a partial fulfillment of Numbers chapter 24, verse 17, where it was said that a star would rise out of Jacob, and that he would, well, let me just read it real quick. Numbers chapter 24, verse 17. "I shall see him, but not now. I shall behold him, but not nigh. There shall come a star out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel, and shall smite the corners of Moab." Some see in that what David has done here in our text. And winning against the Moabites, again, these are the ancient, troublesome figures. Moab and Ammon, these descendants of Israel's long ago cousins, I guess for lack of a better term we could describe it. In 2 Kings chapter 3, 2 Kings chapter 3, you learn how that these Moabites, that the victory that David secured over them and making them tributaries, this was not a temporary thing. This was something that lasted. In fact, it's later on, even after the kingdom splits. David is king, Solomon is king. When Rehoboam is king, the kingdom splits. All the way down until the time of Ahab, the wicked king, you finally see Moab start to buck and to rebel against that. It says in 2 Kings chapter 3, verse 4, "Mesha, king of Moab, was a sheepmaster, and rendered unto the king of Israel 100,000 lambs and 100,000 rams with the wool." Even all these generations later, the Moabites are still, in a sense, pressed under and tributaries to the nation of Israel. So what you're reading about here in 2 Samuel chapter 8, verse 1 and 2, don't pass over those as, he won a battle. No, David is winning large-scale victories. He is claiming regions, a great expansion of land, a great expansion of people, an inward an income of wealth and tribute from these regions. All right, verse number 3. It says, "David smote also Hadadezer, the son of Rehob, king of Zobah, and he went to recover his border at the river Euphrates." Again, that doesn't mean much to us probably because we haven't seen Israel even get anywhere close to a region that big, right? When they leave Egypt, they come through the wilderness, they get to the sea, they get to the Jordan River. They occupy some land on the east side of Jordan, and then they cross over to occupy all the land west of Jordan to the Great Sea, to the Mediterranean. And yet the land that God had promised Abraham was far more expansive than they ever took under the time of Joshua, ever took during the time of the judges or under King Saul. In Genesis chapter 15, notice this promise that was made to Abraham. Genesis chapter 15. And we'll just start here in verse 13. Genesis chapter 15 and verse 13. It says, "And he said unto Abram, Know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. And also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge, and afterward shall they come out with great substance. And thou shalt go to thy fathers in peace, thou shalt be buried in a good old age, but in the fourth generation they shall come hither again, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. And it came to pass that when the sun went down and it was dark, behold, a smoking furnace and a burning lamp that passed between those pieces. In the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, Unto thy seed have I given this land." Now how much of that? "From the river of Egypt unto the great river, the river Euphrates." This huge expanse of land that hasn't been really a reality yet. We haven't seen Israel at all pursue a land expansion to that extent. And yet David starts that way. David starts that progress. And under King David, you're going to see an expansion that's greater than any king that you're going to see for Israel. In fact, turn over one more to the book of 1 Kings chapter 4. 1 Kings chapter 4, it's talking about the time of King Solomon's reign. And notice what it says here. 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 20. "Judah and Israel were many, as the sand which is by the sea in multitude, eating and drinking and making merry. And Solomon reigned over all kingdoms from the river unto the land of the Philistines, under the border of Egypt. They brought presents and served Solomon all the days of his life." Now, I'm going to interject this here. There is a belief that is very prevalent today, and a lot of it is, it's really held to those that are anti the nation of Israel. There's obviously a conflict in the Middle East about a portion of land, right? Who it belongs to. Does it belong to Israel? Does it belong to the Palestinians? One argument that is made is that, it's really hard to tell who that land belongs to because historically there's never been a people that occupied that land, right? There's never been a people that really possessed that land. It was always nomads, it was always travelers, it was always pilgrims. There was never actually a settled people in that region for any length of time. That is absolutely not true. During the kingdom of Israel, under the United Kingdoms of David and Solomon, there was a settled kingdom in that region. And that kingdom continued for a couple hundred years. So any of this thought that is like, well, there's never actually been a settled people. Israel never actually settled in that land. That's just absolutely not true. Just absolutely not true. The scriptures bear that out for us. David possessed that land. David expanded that land, and the foundation of his kingdom was established from the land of the Philistines, which if you get out your map, the southwest portion of Israel, places like Gaza and Ascalon and some of those, Ashdod, some of those cities that are mentioned in the Bible, that's in the southwest region, all the way up past Syria and Damascus, heading out toward the river Euphrates. All of that, David at one point was in control of. And that's what we're seeing here in 2 Samuel chapter 8. a far greater expansion that Israel ever had under Joshua, greater expansion certainly than they ever had during the time of the judges or King Saul. All right, 2 Samuel chapter 8, verse 4. And David took from him 1,000 chariots and 700 horsemen and 20,000 footmen, and David huffed all the chariot horses, but reserved of them for 100 chariots. In this expansion, David collects 1,000 chariots, 700 horsemen, and 20,000 men. Now, it's interesting what it mentions that he does there in verse number 4, where it says that he huffed, or some would say that he hamstrung the horses. Why would you do that? Why would you take the horses that you just won in victory and render them useless, render them unable to be used for your military, render them unable to be used for these chariots that you just acquired, right? You think, man, not only is David expanding, but David's taking like all of these goods, all of these supplies, all of these chariots, all of these horses. And then David turns right around and renders these horses useless. Why would you do that? Does it make any sense in the world for a king to get all of these horses and then physically not use them? That doesn't make sense to us to think about that. And yet, Deuteronomy chapter 17 tells us something in particular. Why would David hamstring those horses? Why wouldn't he put them to use in his military? Why wouldn't he put them to use for his army men? Well, let's read what Deuteronomy 17 says. Deuteronomy 17 in verse 14. Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 14. When thou art come unto the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee, and shalt possess it, and shalt dwell therein, and shalt say, I'll set a king over me, like as all the nations that are about me. Thou shalt in any wise set him king over thee, whom the Lord thy God shall choose. One from among thy brethren shalt thou set king over thee. Thou mayest not set a stranger over thee, which is not thy brother. And here's verse 16. But he shall not multiply horses to himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt, to the end that he should multiply horses. For as much as the Lord hath said unto you, ye shall henceforth return no more that way. Why would David do what he did to those horses and not bring them into his service to use for his army, his military? One answer is because God said don't do that. God said don't go to Egypt and don't go around, don't go to these places and multiply to yourself horses. Why would God tell them not to do that? What happens when men do that? What happens when men do multiply to themselves horses? What does happen when men start to increase in might and increase in strength? Not only that, but the greater you get, the less dependent you get upon the Lord. The less faith you have to have. If you're confident in your strength and you're confident in your abilities and you're confident that, you know what, man, nobody can touch us. Look what we've got. We've got chariots innumerable. We've got horses to fill them. What did David himself say in Psalm 20 and verse 7? Psalm 20, verse 7, these words from David himself. Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we will remember the name of the Lord our God. When we read that, and when Brother John came through and he talked about that passage, some people do. So that's what some people trust in. David did not. And you're not to be left thinking, oh, well, yeah, David didn't because David never had a very large army. David never really, he actually did. David, in his expansion and in the wars that he fought and in the battles he won, he acquired for himself a huge number of horses and then intentionally took steps to make sure that they wouldn't be useful. He didn't want to trust in those things. And he wanted to be obedient to what God had said. He wanted to obey the Lord's word. He showed his own faith. And you know what? God said, we don't need these. We don't need them. We're going to keep the smallest little amount. What did he say? What did our text say? In verse number 4, he reserved 100 chariots. That's not a lot considering the thousands of footmen, the 1,000 chariots, and the 700 horsemen. David's like, we'll reserve this small portion. That's faith. When you intentionally take steps that negate your own strength and your own power, you are rendering yourself to a place where you have to trust God more than you did yesterday. You don't have the strength. You don't have the capability that you did just yesterday. David, look at all these horses that we've got. Hamstring them. Render them useless. They're not kill them, but we're not using these in battle. We go to battle, we're going to trust God. We're going to obey what God has said, and we're going to believe that He'll give us the victory. We're not going to rely on the enemy's horses to give us victory. That's not how we're going to grow. David's expansion was not going to be under worldly terms or worldly means. He trusted God to give him victory. That's just an amazing thing that David did there that nobody would do. Nobody would do that to those horses, yet David did. And then the great victories continue. In verse number 5, it says, when the Syrians of Damascus came to succor Hadadezer, king of Zobah, David slew of the Syrians 22,000 men. Then David put garrisons in Syria of Damascus. And the Syrians became servants to David and brought gifts. And the Lord preserved David whithersoever he went. When reinforcements came to try and help David's enemies, David won over them as well. David destroyed them, made them tributaries. God has preserved David wherever he goes. That's not the only time in this passage that phrase is going to be used. Verse number 7. David took the shields of gold that were of the servants of Hadadezer and brought them to Jerusalem. And from Beda and from Berothai, cities of Hadadezer, King David took exceeding much brass. And when Toi, king of Hamath, heard that David had smitten all the host of Hadadezer, then Toi sent Joram his son unto King David to salute him, to bless him, because he had fought against Hadadezer and smitten him. For Hadadezer had fought wars with Toi, and Joram brought with him vessels of silver, vessels of gold, and vessels of brass. David is being recognized now by surrounding folks. Again, they are bringing him gifts. I get the enemy of my enemy as my friend. These others that had war against these people are recognizing David's greatness and David's might, and they're bringing him gifts, gold and silver and brass. And what does David do with those, right? What does he do? Those are his trophies, right? The things that they bring to David when he gets those shields of gold, when he wins these great victories, when he collects the spoils. Those are his trophies, right? Those are testimonies to his glory. Those are testimony to his victory, right? No. What does David do with those things? Verse 11, which also King David did dedicate unto the Lord with the silver and the gold, and he dedicated of all nations which he subdued. David did not take these trophies to his own glory. He took his spoils of war, he took his victory winnings and dedicated them to the Lord. Now again, let's turn over to the parallel passage, 1 Chronicles 18. Notice what it says there that he did with those. 1 Chronicles 18, verse 7, and David took the shields of gold that were on the servants of Hadadezer and brought them to Jerusalem. Likewise from Tibbath and from Chun, cities of Hadadezer, brought David very much brass. Notice this, wherewith Solomon made the brazen sea and the pillars and the vessels of brass. When we say that David dedicated these things to the Lord, that's not that's not just spiritual talk. No, that's real talk. He dedicated these things to the Lord to the extent that these things were actually used later by Solomon in the building of the temple. And the instruments and the pillars and the things that Solomon used to build the temple, the things that David had secured, the things that David had won, even in his wars, David didn't keep these as trophies. David didn't keep these as testaments of his own glory. When David won these spoils, these are the Lord's. And he began a collection that actually ended up resulting in Solomon having a great supply to start building the temple with. Keep reading here. 1 Chronicles 18, verse number 9. So when Tou, king of Hamath, heard how David had smitten all the host of Hadarezer, king of Zobah, he sent Hadaram, his son, to King David to inquire of his welfare and to congratulate him because he had fought against Hadarezer and smitten him. Hadarezer had war with Tou, and with him all manner of vessels of gold and silver and brass. Them also King David dedicated unto the Lord, with the silver and the gold that he brought from all these nations, from Edom, Moab, the children of Ammon, from the Philistines, and from Amalek. We read in Deuteronomy 17 what kings were supposed to do, right? They weren't supposed to what? Multiply to themselves horses. But I stopped a verse short. Deuteronomy 17, verse 17, after saying that kings shouldn't multiply to themselves horses, what did Deuteronomy 17:17 say? Neither shall he multiply wives to himself, that his heart turn not away, neither shall he greatly multiply to himself silver and gold. David did that, right? Now, David struggled with a part of that. David did have more wives, really, than he should have. And yet, there is a very real aspect in which he is now making an attempt to follow these commands and to be obedient to what the Lord had said that kings shouldn't do. Kings do not need to multiply to themselves an unending amount of wealth. David had all this wealth given to him. Tribute from subject nations, spoils of war, shields of gold that were given to him in victory. These were his trophies, right? He said, no. These things are going to be dedicated to the Lord. And then they were actually used to build the temple. So when we say David dedicated these things in the Lord, this wasn't just something David did in his heart. He wasn't just thankful, Lord, you gave me these. No, he actually set these aside so that they could be used by the Lord. These old enemies that are mentioned there in 1 Chronicles 18 and then in our text, 2 Samuel 8 verse 12, Syria, Moab, the children of Ammon, of the Philistines, and of Amalek. Those are the same nations that are mentioned in Psalm 83 and that David has now found great victory over. God has blessed David in such a way. Now let's read our text. 2 Samuel 8 verse 13. And David gat him a name when he returned from smiting of the Syrians in the valley of Salt. David got a name for himself, right? Fame and reputation for his valor, his courage, and his victory. And yet, maybe all the other nations don't get to see what David is actually doing with those things, that those things become dedicated to the Lord. That David's just not increasing his wealth and stature for his own glory. But David got himself a name. Verse 14, he put garrisons in Edom. Throughout all Edom put he garrisons, and all they of Edom became David's servants, and the Lord preserved David whithersoever he went. This confirms what we thought about David. When the Lord told David that he was not going to be able to build the temple. And you actually learn later the reason for that. It was because David was a man of war instead of a man of peace. He was a man that had shed much blood. He was a man of war, and that's why he wasn't going to be able to build the temple. And I clarified in that God was not saying that he was mad at him. God was not displeased with David. It was just that under those circumstances, the Lord didn't want his temple built that way. And this passage confirms for us that God is with David. God has blessed him. God has preserved David and protected him everywhere that he went. Okay, the Lord was with David in fighting these battles. You also get the impression when it says that David did these things and that God preserved him, David was not sitting on the sidelines. David was not inactive in these battles, but that he was out there. He was with his people fighting these battles. That will give you the contrast in chapter 11 when David is not out with his army, when David is not out with those that are going to battle, and he gets himself in trouble in that chapter. You get to see that that was out of character for David. He really was a warrior king for Israel. So from verse 1 down through verse 14, David greatly enhances Israel in their presence in the region, their expansion, their borders, their tribute. Israel reaches a great, great time of glory under King David. So his kingdom is fully established here in these passages. Now lastly, number 2, let's cover these last few verses, the administration of King David. It says there in verse number 15, and David reigned. He had brought glory to Israel, safety. Remember, he put garrisons in Syria. He's put them in Edom. He's got troops. He's got stations of people everywhere. Israel is safe. Israel is secure. They are prominent. They are wealthy. They are recognized. But that's not it. David reigned over all Israel, and David executed judgment and justice unto all his people. You see, David as a warrior king only tells part of the story. David was a good king, not just because he won victories, not just because he grew the empire, not just because he expanded the borders. David was a good king in that he executed judgment and justice for his own people. David took care of things at home as much as he took care of things abroad. He was not negligent of those things. You know, when we talk about leaders, we always kind of talk about their strengths, right? And this one's got a really good foreign policy, and this one's got a really good domestic policy, and this one's good in this area, and this one's good in this area. David's the complete package, right? David's brave. He's courageous. He's faithful. He's faithful to God. He's loyal. He's obedient. He's trusting. He's willing to do what's right for his people. He's willing to do what's best for them. And he'll execute judgment and justice. You know, Romans chapter 13 talks about civil government. It talks about the responsibilities even of the government, right? To be a terror to evildoers, right? The government, the powers that be, they're not supposed to be a terror to good works, but to evil works. David is that kind of king that establishes judgment and justice, willing to do what's right. See, don't forget, everybody's real gung-ho about the other stuff. And people think about that in terms of David and how he expanded and he led them in victory and he restored Israel to prominence and to glory, wealth and security among the nations. David is a good king, not just because of those things. That's part of it, sure. But what is right matters to David. Making sure that things are done right in his kingdom matters to him. That's not a part that he leaves off. Don't forget those things. Sometimes we leave that part off, right? That David's a good king. And Joab, the son of Zeruiah, was over the host. Jehoshaphat, son of Ahilud, was recorder. Zadok, the son of Ahitub, and Ahimelech, the son of Abiathar, the priests. Sariah was the scribe. Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, was over both the Cherethites and the Pelethites. And David's sons were chief rulers. We're introduced to key people here. Joab was over his army. Now, that was his nephew, but not just because he was nephew. Remember back in 1 Chronicles chapter 11, David had promised that whoever goes up the first and takes care of these Jebusites in Jerusalem, I'll make him my captain. Joab, patriotic as ever, took it. Joab's captain of the army. This one named Jehoshaphat is the recorder. Right? It says there that he's the recorder. He's the detailer. He's the one that's going to keep track of significant events. He's going to be one that takes notes, all the things that were involved in the office of a recorder. Zadok and Ahimelech were priests, right? The religious side, it's addressed. They've got order there. Sariah was the scribe, and Benaiah was captain over the Cherethites and the Pelethites. You can read about those, people that were with David even toward the beginning, from the time he was just all the way back at Ziklag. What does all this mean? David has a fully functioning kingdom. Okay, you've got the army, you've got the priesthood, you've got the captains, you've got the scribes and the recorders, you've got the guards, you've got everything is addressed. Israel has truly entered a time of security and peace under King David. That was hard fought, and David earned that through great victories. The Lord gave him those. The Lord protected and preserved him from those. But when you read chapter 8, you walk away thinking a couple of things about David. He is a great king as far as outwardly, right? What the nations think of him, what he's willing to do and accomplish against the enemies of Israel. David is a great king inwardly. He will rule in righteousness, and he will try to execute judgment and justice. He will establish his kingdom, and so that everything's taken care of and everything is addressed. Everything's orderly. Everything has fallen into place under King David. So chapter 8, there's not maybe what you would see as a ton of significant events, right? It's a couple of battles, and it's some names. And yet when you get to the end of chapter 8, you are left thinking, this is the greatest place in the world to be right now. Israel under King David, secure, wealthy, prosperous, blessed by God. Everything's being done orderly. Everything's being done through judgment and justice. David cares about doing what's right. This is a far contrast to the backbiting, the conniving, the underhanded things that were being done during the time of Saul and are later going to happen in future kings of Israel. You read chapter 8, and David is just the king we hoped that he would be. He cares about what is right. He cares so much about what is right that when he goes and when he secures great victories from other lands, he's the kind of king that's like, that's probably too many horses. We don't want to start trusting in those horses, guys. Cut them off. That is enough right there. That many chariots, that's enough. No more than that. That's too much. He cares about those things. When he wins, when he gets his trophies, when he gets his spoils. God gave us these victories. We're going to dedicate these things to the Lord. I'm not able to build the temple. This is going to look real good in there. My son's going to be able to use those things. He just cares. He cares about what is right. He cares about the honor of the Lord as much as he cares about his own name or his own kingdom. That's a great king. All right, next week we'll get into chapter number 9, famous story of a young man named Mephibosheth. Okay, so have you heard that name before? All right, practice saying that 10 times. All right, Mephibosheth. Let's pray. Father,